بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم. Today our lecture is about adrenal glands hormone. The lecture will be presented by Dal Ibrahim Wagalla, Assistant Professor of Clinical Chemistry. By the end of this lecture, students should be able to identify the functional anatomy and zones of the adrenal, identify the principal hormone secreted from each zone, describe the regulation of synthesis and release of steroid hormone, identify the major mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoids, their biological action and their target tissue or organ, identify the chemical nature of catecholamines and their biosynthesis. The adrenal gland, it is also known as suprarenal gland because of their location over or just on the top of the two kidneys. It is a triangular or pyramidal shaped gland. As we mentioned, it is located on the top of both kidneys in each side, produce hormones, help regulate metabolism, immune system, blood pressure, response to stress, and other essential functions. Anatomy of the adrenal gland. Each gland is divided into two parts, the outer and the inner part. The outer part or the outer region is called the cortex, and also it is the largest part of the adrenal gland. That is constitute about 80% of the cortex, consists of 3 zones. The inner part of the adrenal gland, which is called the medulla. The medulla is the smallest portion of the gland. It is constitutes about 20% of the gland. The medulla and each of the zone in the cortex are responsible to produce specific hormones. Here we can see the two layers or two parts of the adrenal gland, the inner layer, which is the medulla, and the outer layer, which is the cortex. Outside the gland is encapsulated by the capsule. Then we are going to talk about the adrenal cortex. As we mentioned, the adrenal cortex is divided into 3 zones, which each secrete different hormones that carry out a specific function throughout the body. The first zone is zona glomerulosa. This zone is the outermost zone of the cortex. It is produce mineralocorticoids, mainly aldosterone, is the major hormone controlling the sodium and potassium levels and thus fluid balance within the bloodstream and interstitial fluid. The second zone is Zona of Fasciculata. This zone is responsible for production of glucocorticoid, mainly cortisol and corticosterone. This hormone play a major role in regulation of glucose, amino acid, and fat metabolism. The secretion of cell is controlled by hypothalamic pituitary axis via ACTH. So this is here we have a negative feedback mechanism, zone of reticularis. This is the innermost layer of the cortex, which is responsible for the production or synthesis of androgen. The most important androgens which secreted by the zona of reticularis is dihydroepiandrosterone and androstenedione. The androgen are released into bloodstream and taken up in the testes and ovaries to produce testosterone and estrogen. Here we can summarize the three zones of the adrenal cortex. The outer layer is zona glomerulosa. This zone is secrete mineralocorticoids, aldosterone. Aldosterone is responsible for the regulation of sodium, potassium, and water homeostasis. The second zone is zona fasciculata. This zone produces glucocorticoids, cortisol. Cortisol is responsible for the regulation of glucose homeostasis and many others. The inner layer is zona reticularis. This is responsible for the production of sex steroid hormones, androgens. The inner part of the adrenal gland is the cortex. Is the medulla. The medulla is responsible for the production of catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamines. Here we can show the capsule around the adrenal gland. These three zones are found in the cortex: zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and then zona reticularis. The three zones is represented the cortex. After that we find adrenal medulla. Synthesis of adrenocorticosteroid hormone. All steroid hormones have in common the 17 carbon cyclopentano brehydro phenanthrin nucleus. Additional carbon can be added as a position 10 and 13 or a side chain attached to carbon 17. So we have a steroid nucleus which is in the left side composed of A, B, C, D. Then the location of the carbon in the position 10 or 13 or as a side chain in the carbon 17 can give the different structure of the different steroid hormones. Biochemical action of adrenocorticosteroid hormone. First, we are going to talk about the function of mineralocorticoids, aldosterone. Aldosterone promotes sodium reabsorption at distal convoluted tubule of the kidney, sodium retention accompanied by corresponding excretion of potassium, hydrogen, and ammonia in exchange to sodium. So, mineralocorticoids is responsible for the retention of sodium and excretion of potassium, hydrogen, and ammonia ions. Second is glucocorticoid, cortisol. Cortisol had many effects. The first effect is on blood glucose metabolism. They promote gluconeogenesis. They work in tandem with insulin from the pancreas to maintain blood glucose level in the proper level. So it have a major role in the regulation of blood glucose. Effect on lipid metabolism, also glucocorticoid or cortisol increase lipolysis in adipose tissue and reduce synthesis of triglycerides. Effect on protein and nucleic acid metabolism. Cortisol is responsible to promote transcription and protein synthesis in the liver. They also cause catabolic effect in extrahepatic tissue, result in enhanced degradation of protein. So it has a catabolic effect in the extrahepatic tissue in the synthesis and transcription of protein. Also has effect on water and electrolyte metabolism. Deficiency of them cause increased production of ADH, which can decrease glomerular filtration rate, causing water retention in the body. Effect on immune system. Cortisol suppresses the immune response directly and indirectly by affecting most of the cell and participate in immune reaction and inflammatory reaction. So it is a powerful uh, anti-inflammatory even when secreted at normal level. For that, it is a one reason why strong corticosteroids are used with all diseases involving inflammatory process, including autoimmune disorder, to have a good effect or immunosuppressing effect on the immune system. Cortisol have effect on the cardiovascular system. Cortisol could control the contraction of the wall of the mid-sized arteries in increasing blood pressure, but this hypertensive effect is moderated by calcium and magnesium. Have directly affect the heart by regulating sodium and potassium in heart cell and increasing the strength of contraction of heart muscle. So it has a good function for or regulation in the cardiovascular system. Cortisol had effect on central nervous system. The change of behavior, mood, excitability, and even electrical activity of neurons in the brain frequently occur in cases of excess and deficient cortisol level. Many signs and symptoms of adrenal fatigue involve moodiness, decreased tolerance, decreased clarity of thought, decreased memory. This occur because the brain is affected by both too little and too much cortisol. So, cortisol is very important hormone and must be regulated or kept in a normal value because the brain cannot work probably if the cortisol is too high or too little. The adrenal gland has anti-stress effect on all of the body. We have four major categories of stress. We can have physical stress, chemical stress, thermal stress, and emotional stress. The physical stress, example of physical stress, overwork, lack of sleep, athletic overtraining. This is appear during hard exercises. Chemical stress, environmental, pollutant, allergic to food, diet high refined carbohydrate, endocrine gland imbalance. This is called a chemical stress. Thermal stress, overheating or overchilling of the body. And finally, we have emotional and mental stress. Let us see how the adrenal gland help in decrease the stress. During stress, cortisol must successfully provide more blood glucose, mobilize fats and protein for a backup supply of glucose, modify immune reaction, heartbeat, blood pressure, brain alertness, and nervous system responsiveness. If cortisol level cannot rise in response to this need, maintaining body under stress is nearly impossible. So, the stress is stimulate the cortisol to be production. Here we can show the function which is corticosteroid what catecholamines can do. They have a function in immune system, muscles, liver, fat cell. This is organs and cells that these hormones are working in. from the stress circadian rhythm. When we have stress, the hypothalamus is secreted cortisol releasing hormone. The cortisol releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to produce adrenocorticotrophic hormone. Then this hormone is stimulate adrenal gland to produce glucocorticoids and catecholamines. The glucocorticoids and catecholamines had altered immune system, net loss of amino acid and glucose, deamination of protein into amino acid, and hence stimulate gluconeogenesis to produce glucose, free fatty acid mobilization, and in the heart rate is increased. During the fasting, people have considerable difficulty when on a prolonged fasting. They will always rationalize the problem encountered on the fasting and being due to the body detoxifying. During a fasting, the body will call on the adrenal to produce glucocorticoid to maintain blood glucose level, which is adequate for normal level of activity. The glucocorticoids can elevate blood glucose by breaking down protein into carbohydrates through the process of gluconeogenesis. So, also fasting is stimulate the adrenal gland to produce their hormone. Regulation of glucocorticoid. The secretion of glucocorticoid from the adrenal cortex is regulated by negative feedback involving cortisol releasing hormone, corticosteroid releasing hormone secretion by the hypothalamic CRH, then act on the anterior pituitary to stimulate adrenocorticotrophic hormone secretion, which then stimulates the adrenal cortex into cortisol secretion. About 70% of cortisol is bound to carrier protein called corticosteroid binding globulin. Another 15 is bound to albumin. The remaining 15% exist free in solution. So we have three forms of cortisol in the body, bound to protein carrier called glucocorticoid or corticosteroid binding globulins. Other is bound to albumin, and the remaining is free. The regulation of cortisol secretion is by the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. The HPA axis or HPA system, a negative feedback system, is one of the most important elements of homeostasis, the process that maintains the steady internal biochemical and physiological balance in the body. This system, the HPA, adjusts cortisol level according to the need of the body under normal and stress condition via ACTH. So the body regulates the production of cortisol through the ATH hormone. ATH is secreted from the anterior pituitary gland in response to order from the hypothalamus and travel in the bloodstream to the adrenal cortex. Catecholamines biosynthesis. Catecholamines, we have the inner regions of the adrenal gland, which is the medulla. The medulla is a functional unit of it is the inner layer of the adrenal gland. The functional unit of the adrenal medulla is the chromaffin cell, which function as a neuroendocrine cell. In response to stimulation, chromaffin cells secrete the hormones epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine, noradrenaline directly into the bloodstream. the medulla is involved in extreme stress, and within this context, epinephrine and norepinephrine both work with cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are important mainly in the crisis situation. So they work in the crisis of the stress. How is the catecholamines synthesized? Catecholamines are synthesized from the tyrosine. Tyrosine is the precursor for the synthesis of the catecholamines. The catecholamines are produced in response to fight, fright, and flight. The 3F: fight, fright, and flight. These include emergencies like shock, cold, fatigue, emotional condition like anger. What is the biochemical function of catecholamines? Catecholamines have different function or many function they done to the body. They had effect on carbohydrate metabolism. Both of them can increase glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis and decrease glycogenesis. So they increase blood glucose. Catecholamine promotes the release of glucose from the liver and decrease its utilization by the muscle. Epinephrine inhibits insulin secretion but promote glucagon secretion. So we can summarize that the catecholamines increase the blood glucose level. We can also mention them as antagonists for insulin. Effect on lipid metabolism. Both of them enhance the breakdown of triglyceride in adipose tissue. This causes increase in free fatty acid in the circulation, which are effectively utilized by the heart and muscle as fuel source. So they enhance the breakdown of triglyceride in the adipose tissue. Effect in physiological function. Catecholamines increase cardiac output, blood pressure, oxygen consumption. They cause small muscle relaxation in bronchia, GIT, and blood vessel, supplying blood to the muscles. That is all about the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex, and the adrenal medulla, the main hormone, glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids and catecholamines. Thank you for good listening and see you in next lecture.